Welcome to True Echo, where real voices resonate louder than fiction. In today's story, what starts as a routine visit to the bank spirals into a public reckoning when an elderly black man in a wheelchair is humiliated by a smug teller, until a single document reveals a truth no one in the room was ready for. Stay tuned to witness the moment power speaks softly, but changes everything. The automatic doors of Guardian State Bank's West Haven branch hissed open at 9:03 a.m., right as the sun poured in through tall windows onto the glistening tiles. Elliot Dandridge, a 63-year-old black man in a wheelchair, rolled silently into the lobby. He wore a slate-gray windbreaker zipped up to the collar and a weathered baseball cap pulled low over calm eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little over the years. He made a slow, deliberate loop through the quiet lobby, past the sparsely seated clients and half-awake staff still clutching paper coffee cups, and then headed for the front desk. With the steady hands of someone who was never in a rush to prove anything, Elliot parked just shy of the counter and addressed the young woman perched behind it. "Excuse me," he said, voice smooth and even. "Could I speak with the branch manager, please?" Megan Alcott barely glanced up. Platinum blonde, early 30s, her bob was sharp, her mascara heavier than her patience. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, barely concealing her disdain as she twirled her pen and continued looking at her screen. "No," Elliot replied, still polite. "But I'd appreciate." She cut him off with a raised hand, then turned to a coworker and muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "Betty's here to cash somebody else's check or complain about something we can't fix." The statement, though quiet, dropped like a weight in the room. A teenager sitting with his mother glanced up, shifting in his seat. The mother frowned, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Elliot, for his part, didn't flinch. He blinked slowly and tilted his head, not in confusion or disbelief, but calculation. "I can wait," he said, just as calmly as before. "But I'd still like to speak with the manager." Megan exhaled dramatically, as though she'd just been asked to clean the building from top to bottom. "Sir, unless you're a client here, I'm afraid the manager doesn't have time for walk-ins." "I'm not here to make a withdrawal," Elliot said, still controlled. "Then what are you here for?" Megan snapped. "Because I don't really have the patience today for." "Is there a problem?" came a firm voice from the side. Eduardo, a Latino client services rep in his 40s, had entered from the hallway. His arms were crossed, his gaze sharp. "I've got it, Eduardo," Megan replied curtly, waving him off. "Miss Alcott," Eduardo said, his voice dropping an octave, "you might want to lower your tone." "I said I've got it," she hissed back, louder now. Elliot turned to Eduardo with the slightest nod, a quiet signal of appreciation, and then back to Megan. "Please," he said again. "Just the manager. That's all I'm asking." With an eye roll and a sigh that was practically a performance, Megan slapped a clipboard onto the counter. "Fine. Write your name down. Someone might get to you in an hour." Elliot didn't touch the clipboard. Instead, he calmly pulled a worn leather folder from his lap and began to open it. Megan, uninterested, leaned against the counter and turned back toward Eduardo. "I don't know why some people think demanding attention gets them somewhere." Eduardo said nothing. But others in the room were now watching more openly, an older woman in scrubs, a man by the coffee machine, the teenager who still hadn't stopped texting but now kept glancing up. Elliot unfolded a trifold document and placed it gently on the counter. "I'd appreciate it if you'd hand this to your branch manager." "We don't accept unsolicited paperwork," Megan said flatly. "If this is about a complaint." "It's not a complaint," Elliot interrupted. "It's documentation." "I already told you," she started again, voice rising. "You're not on the appointment schedule, so unless you're depositing something." A woman near the coffee station leaned in to whisper to her friend, "She's talking to him like he's a child." Elliot remained steady. Megan pushed the paper aside with her manicured fingernail, gave a tight-lipped smile, and said, "If you're not going to sign in, I'm going to have to ask you to move out of the reception area." Elliot turned to Eduardo. "Would you mind taking a look at this, please?" Eduardo stepped forward without hesitation. Megan reached out to block him. He doesn't need to. But Eduardo held up a hand, not to Elliot, but to her. He picked up the document, scanned the contents, and froze. This is from corporate, he said slowly. Megan blinked. What? Eduardo didn't answer her. He turned the document over, reading the bottom line. I think you should get Brian. Now. Megan hesitated. He's with. Now, Eduardo repeated, more firmly this time. Megan finally picked up the phone and dialed an extension. Across the room, the mother of the teenager stared hard at Megan. The boy whispered, is he like, an undercover boss or something? His mother replied without looking away, he doesn't need to be undercover. Look at her face now. Indeed, Megan had grown quiet. Unnervingly so. Elliot just sat there, calm as ever, hands lightly on his wheels. He wasn't what anyone expected, but that was the point. And what came next would upend the balance of the entire room. Megan turned away from the counter after hanging up the phone, her shoulders stiff, her hands fidgeting nervously with the clipboard she'd so confidently slammed down minutes before. The air in the bank had shifted. You could feel it, tight, electric. Clients weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Elliot, still composed, glanced around the lobby. The receptionist desk no longer held the authority it did when he entered. In fact, the entire room seemed to have tilted on its axis. Megan tried to resume her normal posture, crossed arms, chin slightly raised, but the edges of her confidence had frayed. Corporate, she mumbled to Eduardo, now avoiding direct eye contact. Eduardo didn't respond. He merely stood silently, the document still in hand, like it weighed more than just paper. Seconds later, the hallway door clicked open. A man in a crisp shirt, loosened tie, and graying temples stepped out. Brian Covington, the branch manager. In his early 50s and built like a former linebacker, Brian had the kind of presence that made people straighten up without realizing it. He scanned the room once and, without being told a thing, understood something was off. Mr. Dandridge, he asked, eyes landing on Elliot with sudden clarity. Elliot nodded. Brian. The simple exchange, the use of first names, the familiarity, was enough to send a ripple through the lobby. Megan froze. Brian strode forward, extending a hand. I wasn't informed you'd be visiting this location today. I like to keep things simple, Elliot said, shaking his hand with the strength of a man who'd weathered storms in silence. Surprise visits help me see things for what they really are. Brian's face remained neutral, but his eyes flickered to Megan. Elliot gestured toward the counter. I already submitted a document that should explain why I'm here. Eduardo handed it over, and Brian read it quickly, his jaw setting harder with each line. Understood, he said quietly. Then louder, Megan, my office. Now. Megan's lips parted. I didn't. Brian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Now. Megan moved slowly, her heels suddenly sounding too loud on the floor. Before Elliot wheeled himself down the hallway, he turned to Brian once more. Before we talk, I'd like to review this morning's footage. The security system covers the front area, yes? Brian nodded. 6-point coverage synced to the internal server. I'll pull it up now. Megan's face turned pale. Wait, Mr. Dandridge, I didn't know who you were. That's the point, Elliot replied, not unkindly. But would you have treated me differently if I looked the same but wasn't someone important? The question hung in the air like smoke. No one filled the silence. Not even Megan. Inside Brian's office, the lights dimmed as he pulled up the footage from 9:03 a.m. They watched it all play out again, Elliot's entrance, Megan's dismissive comments, Eduardo's attempt to intervene. It was all there. Word for word. Expression for expression. I need this sent to legal, Elliot said softly. Already done, Brian replied. Elliot's voice remained steady. I didn't come here to fire anyone, Brian. But I didn't come here to be spoken to like a street beggar either. Brian leaned back in his chair. He looked tired now, like the weight of everything he'd allowed to slide for years had finally caught up. There were complaints about her tone in the past, Brian admitted. From staff, even some clients. But her metrics were strong, and she followed procedures, on paper. Today though, this was something else. It wasn't just unprofessional, Elliot said. It was personal. Brian said nothing for a moment. Then, with a quiet breath, he stood. I'll take care of it. Back in the lobby, people were still watching, some pretending to scroll their phones, others not even bothering with the charade. The absence of Megan behind the counter left an eerie stillness. Judith Emery, a sharply dressed woman in her early 60s, stepped into the bank and paused. She'd expected to swing by and handle a few things for one of her investment portfolios. Instead, she'd walked into a reckoning. When she saw Elliot, her eyes widened with genuine warmth. Mr. Dandridge, she said, approaching with a smile. Didn't expect to see you here today. Elliot returned her smile. Neither did she, he said, nodding subtly toward the now vacant reception desk. Judith turned and met Megan's eyes just as the young woman was disappearing into the hallway. She didn't say a word, but the expression she gave Megan, part disappointment, part disdain, spoke volumes. Around the room, clients leaned closer to each other. That woman knows him, someone whispered. More than knows, another said. She just called him Mr. Dandridge like he's her boss. And he was. Minutes passed. Then the hallway door reopened. Brian stepped out first, folder in hand. Megan followed behind, stripped of her name badge and carrying her folded coat. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. No speech. No outburst. Just the slow, defeated walk of someone who'd finally seen herself through the eyes of everyone else. Elliot sat quietly near the front desk. When Brian returned, he nodded. It's done. I'd like to speak to your team, Elliot said. Brian turned and gestured toward the staff lounge. Moments later, 6 employees gathered, Eduardo, Terence, a young woman from loans, 2 tellers, and Clarence the janitor. They stood in a quiet semicircle, unsure what was coming next. But Elliot's words would reach further than any reprimand. And by the end of it, they would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Elliot didn't rise. He remained seated in his wheelchair, positioned calmly in the center of the lobby as the staff gathered before him. Yet, the gravity he commanded made it feel like he stood 10 feet tall. The 6 employees before him, Eduardo, Terence, the young woman from loans, 2 tellers, and Clarence the janitor, stood in respectful silence. They weren't there because they were told to be. They were there because something deep inside told them they needed to hear what he had to say. Elliot let a beat pass, the weight of the moment settling over the group. He looked at them, not with disappointment or anger, but with something far more powerful, lived experience. I didn't come here today to trap anyone, Elliot began, his voice firm but not loud. I didn't come to catch someone slipping or to fire a person. That's not my role. He paused. No one moved. I came because, every few months, I visit our branches. I don't announce it. I don't wear a suit. I just show up. Sit. Watch. Ask simple questions. Not to test your banking skills, but to see how people are treated, when they look like they have nothing to offer you. A visible reaction rippled across the group. Terence lowered his eyes. The woman from loans shifted uncomfortably. Even Eduardo, who had spoken up earlier, looked like he was holding his breath. Today, Elliot continued, I wasn't addressed as a client. I wasn't addressed as a man. I wasn't even addressed as a human being. I was spoken to like a problem. Like an inconvenience. And the only reason that changed, was when Megan realized I had power. The silence in the room was almost reverent. Even clients seated nearby listened closely, the usual clatter of papers and phone calls all but gone. Elliot looked directly at Terence. "But you saw something wasn't right," he said, "and you pressed record. You didn't say a word, but you knew it mattered. That takes something." Terence looked stunned. "I didn't know what else to do." "That's okay," Elliot said gently. "You didn't need to fix it. You just needed to acknowledge it. And you did." Then he turned to Eduardo. "You spoke up. Not to protect me, but because it was the right thing to do. That means more than you know." Eduardo cleared his throat, visibly moved. "Honestly, I thought I was going to get written up." "Maybe in another bank," Elliot replied, "but not this one." He turned back to the full group now, eyes sweeping across their faces. "Some of you said nothing. I understand. It's hard when someone above you is doing wrong. Most people freeze. But I want you to remember something." He leaned forward slightly in his chair, the tension in his voice sharpening. "The way you treat a person when you think they can't help you, that's the version of yourself the world remembers." A few of the tellers blinked rapidly, like they were holding something back. "You don't have to be perfect," Elliot said. "You don't have to save the day. But you do have to try. Every time someone walks through that door, they're trusting you with more than money. They're trusting you not to humiliate them. Not to reduce them." From the corner, Judith, still seated near the window, quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Elliot took a long breath. "Megan lost her job today. Not because of me. Because she exposed something in herself that doesn't belong in a place built on trust." He looked around one last time. "This branch can be better. You can set the tone. You can create a place where no one questions whether they belong. That choice isn't mine. It's yours." Brian stood nearby, quiet, his arms folded. The words weren't just echoing through the lobby. They were leaving a mark. Elliot began to turn his chair toward the door when someone behind him quietly cleared their throat. "Sir," came a voice. "If I may." It was Clarence, the janitor. 65 years old, always early, always quiet. Until now. Elliot stopped and turned slightly in his chair. "Yes." Clarence stepped forward. "I just want to say, thank you. For how you handled this." Elliot smiled softly. "And your name?" "Clarence Duval." "A pleasure to meet you, Clarence." Clarence shifted, looking down for a second before meeting Elliot's eyes again. "Been working here since they opened this branch. 30 years. I've seen people come and go. Promotions. Celebrations. But also the kind of folks who think saying hello to me is beneath them." He didn't name Megan. He didn't have to. "I've cleaned up after people who couldn't be bothered to remember I was a man. But today," Clarence hesitated, his voice thick. "You reminded me what respect sounds like. And what it looks like." Elliot's voice lowered. "Respect doesn't come from a title." "No sir," Clarence said. "It sure doesn't." Across the room, the young woman from Loans stepped forward, visibly nervous. I didn't know what to say earlier. But I saw what happened. I should have said something." Elliot turned to her, calm and direct. "And now you have." She seemed surprised. She had braced for judgment. Instead, she got recognition. That was Elliot's way. One by one, the moment began to ripple. Small gestures. Quiet reflection. And just enough discomfort to stir real change. At the door, Judith met Elliot one more time. "If you ever decide to take a public-facing role," she said with a grin, "I'll be the first in line to vote for you." Elliot chuckled. "No campaign signs in my future." Judith leaned in slightly. that speech? It'll stay with people. Let's hope their actions match it, Elliot replied. Brian stepped up beside him with a sealed envelope. It's an apology letter, from the branch. But I doubt it captures the full weight of what happened. Elliot accepted the envelope but didn't open it. I'm not here for apologies, Brian. I'm here to see who this branch really is. And I saw it today. Brian nodded slowly. We'll be better. Elliot turned to leave, his wheels moving silently across the lobby floor. Don't tell me, he said. Show them. As Elliot rolled toward the automatic doors of the bank, the mood in the lobby was eerily quiet, like the aftermath of a storm that no one had expected but everyone had witnessed. He didn't look back as he exited, but the silence behind him wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken realizations, quiet recalibrations, and the weight of conscience settling over those who remained. He disappeared down the ramp and into the sunlight, but his presence lingered inside like a shadow stamped onto glass. Back near the teller booths, Terence stood rooted in place. The clipboard Megan had once slapped down on the counter now sat untouched, a relic of a different kind of authority. His hands fidgeted around a paperclip, his mind whirling. Finally, he turned to Eduardo, who remained composed but thoughtful. Is this really happening? Terence asked under his breath. Eduardo nodded once. Every bit of it. In the waiting area, Judith closed her leather planner and stood. Her poise was unshaken, her demeanor controlled, but her eyes followed Megan's empty desk like one might glance at a room in a house after someone's moved out. For those still wondering, Judith said aloud, not loudly, but with enough volume to reach across the room, Mr. Dandridge isn't just from corporate. He owns part of this bank. You could hear the collective inhale. A woman in scrubs whispered, no way. Judith simply gave a modest shrug. I've worked with him for over a decade. Brilliant investor. Private. Doesn't talk much, but when he does, he changes things. That sentence didn't need to be finished. Everyone felt its truth. Mr. Fairley, an older client with a weathered face and a flannel jacket, finally spoke up. So he let her talk to him like that, and just waited? Judith nodded. That's how he works. He watches before he acts. Megan's name still hadn't been said out loud, but it didn't have to be. From the staff lounge, Brian returned, holding the sealed envelope Elliot had left unopened. He passed by the front desk and gently placed it in a locked drawer. It wasn't for display. It didn't need to be framed. It just needed to exist, quiet proof that something had happened here that shouldn't be forgotten. He looked around the room. Most of the staff had resumed their duties, but none with the casualness they had earlier. There was a stillness in every movement now. More thoughtfulness. Less autopilot. In the break room, Terence and Eduardo sat with fresh cups of coffee. Neither said much. You ever seen anything like that? Eduardo finally asked. Terence shook his head. Not in real life. Only in movies. But this felt more honest. Eduardo nodded slowly. That's because it was. Meanwhile, back in the lobby, Clarence moved methodically across the tiled floor with his mop. His pace was a little slower than usual. Not tired. Just thoughtful. He paused by the front window and looked outside, watching the parking lot where Elliot had vanished minutes before. He didn't smile, but his expression held a quiet lightness, like someone who'd just seen proof that dignity still mattered. Even the clients seemed different now. There was no buzzing of frustrated complaints. No transactional sharpness. People moved with softer edges, as if one man's calm strength had gently sanded down the room's rough surfaces. At 3:11 p.m., the teenager who'd sat with his mom that morning returned, back from school, still wearing his backpack. He walked up to Terence's counter and handed him a crumpled $5 bill. I want to open an account, he said. Terence blinked. Oh. Planning to deposit that today? No, the boy said. I just wanted to say I thought that guy was cool. I liked how he didn't yell. But people listened anyway. Terrence smiled for the first time that afternoon. Me too. He handed the boy a pen. Best decision you'll make today. And it was. Because that single interaction, just a boy with $5 and the memory of a man who never raised his voice, summed up what the entire day was about. It wasn't about who got fired. It wasn't about corporate power. It was about how you make people feel when you think no one important is watching. Because the truth is, someone always is. In the regional office the next morning, Judith's report had already reached the upper floors. She hadn't filed it formally. She hadn't had to. Her voicemail said it all. I've worked with Guardian State for a long time. And today, I saw something I hope we never forget. Your people don't need more training, they need more listening. That single quote began circulating quietly, passed from inbox to inbox, floor to floor. It didn't go viral on the internet. It went viral where it counted, in the closed rooms where culture was shaped. Back at West Haven, the day wound down. Clarence turned off the floor buffer. Eduardo locked his drawer. Terrence double-checked his till. And Brian stood at the center of the lobby just as the sun dipped through the high glass windows, casting long shadows across the floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call for attention. He just spoke. Let's make sure we never need a reminder like that again. No one responded. But everyone heard him. Because sometimes, after the loudest moment in the room, the only thing more powerful, is the silence that follows. The following morning, the Guardian State Bank West Haven branch opened as usual, doors hissing at 9 a.m., coffee cups in hand, clients lining up with routine expectations. But the atmosphere inside was different. It wasn't something you could put on a clipboard or log in the daily tracker. It was in the glances exchanged between co-workers, the extra second of eye contact with customers, the slowed-down tone of greetings at the front counter. Even the scent of lemon polish on the floors somehow felt more aware. At his usual teller station, Terrence glanced at the empty chair that once belonged to Megan. It had been sanitized and left unoccupied, a visible void that reminded everyone of what had happened, and why it mattered. There was no plaque, no warning sign, just absence. The kind that speaks louder than reprimands ever could. Terrence didn't know it yet, but in corporate offices miles away, someone had already clipped a portion of the security footage, not to upload, not to punish, but to train. To remind future hires that a polished resume meant little if compassion was missing. At 9:22 a.m., the glass doors opened again, and in walked a woman in her late 20s pushing a stroller. She was flustered, juggling a diaper bag, a stack of papers, and a barely awake toddler. She looked like she'd been running on fumes for weeks. Normally, Megan would have waved her toward the online kiosk and told her to get in line like everyone else. But today, Terrence stepped out from behind the counter. "Morning, ma'am," he said gently. "Can I help you with anything?" The woman blinked. She looked at the stroller, then at him. I'm here to set up an account for my daughter. It's her first savings account." Terrence smiled. "Well, you came to the right place." He motioned toward a nearby chair. "Let me bring the paperwork over. You don't need to stand." She nodded slowly, almost unsure of how to react to the sudden human decency. And across the lobby, Clarence watched it happen, just another mop pass in his hand, another floor to shine, but with a quiet smile beneath his mustache. Things were shifting. In Brian's office upstairs, the envelope Elliot had refused to open sat locked in the drawer. He hadn't destroyed it. He hadn't sent it back. It just existed. And that was enough. Brian reviewed the internal branch performance dashboard while his inbox pinged with new messages from regional headquarters. Among them was a short internal memo flagged for all managers. The subject line was simple: Dandridge visit, lessons and actions. Inside, a single quote from Judith Emery led the page. "Your people don't need more training. They need more listening." Brian read it twice. And then again. He leaned back in his chair and thought not of numbers, not of transactions, but of Clarence, Eduardo, Terence, their instincts, their restraint, their silence and their words. Especially the moment Elliot asked Megan, "Would you have treated me differently if I looked the same, but wasn't someone important?" That wasn't a question. That was a mirror. And now, everyone was looking into it. By noon, a soft but significant change had begun to take root. Clients began noticing. A man in a faded work shirt walked in and paused near the reception desk. Terence, now stationed there temporarily, greeted him with a smile. "Welcome to Guardian State. Can I help you today?" The man scratched the back of his head. "Honestly, didn't think anyone would offer." "You'd be surprised," Terence said. "We're working on that." Even Eduardo, normally focused on back-office tasks, had pulled a chair beside the customer kiosk station, just in case someone less tech-savvy needed help. It wasn't assigned. No one told him to. But he did it anyway. People noticed. It wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. At 1:46 p.m., Brian gathered the staff in the break room. Clarence leaned on his mop in the doorway. Eduardo, Terence, the lone reps, and two new tellers all stood quietly, coffee in hand. "I wanted to say something," Brian began, his voice firm but respectful, "and not as your manager, but as someone who missed something important." He looked around. Yesterday wasn't about a corporate check-in. It wasn't about a bad hire or a random incident. It was about what this place feels like to people who walk in every day not knowing whether they'll be treated with respect. He let that settle for a moment before continuing. "Megan's gone. That's a fact. But what stays behind is what we do next." Clarence nodded from the doorway. Eduardo's lips pressed together, approval without words. Brian turned to Terence. "You didn't stay silent. You didn't escalate. You documented what mattered. And because of that, a man who could have walked away decided instead to leave a lesson." Terence lowered his eyes but smiled slightly. "We've all got a moment where we choose who we are," Brian added. "Yesterday was one of those. I'm proud that some of you chose the right side of it." By 3 p.m., the bank felt different. The flow of customers, the interactions, even the tones of voices had changed. It wasn't dramatic. No confetti. No party. Just quiet correctness. And that's where real change begins, not in big announcements, but in small, persistent decisions. At 3:17 p.m., Eduardo pulled a folded note from his pocket. It had been left at his desk earlier that morning. No name, no stamp. Just handwriting on a slip of banking paper. "Thank you for not staying quiet." A regular who noticed. He smiled, folded it again, and tucked it into the back of his name tag. The day wound down. The light through the front windows grew golden again, casting long lines across the tile floor. At closing time, Clarence locked up the cleaning closet and looked once more toward the front desk. Empty again. But it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a reset. By the next week, word about Elliot Dandridge's unannounced visit had begun to ripple beyond the West Haven branch. Not through formal announcements or sensational headlines, but through whispers between tellers in other locations, shared looks at morning briefings, and quiet mentions during team meetings. But at West Haven, the effect was no longer just about Elliot's presence, it was about how people had begun to carry themselves in his absence. On Monday morning, when a non-English speaking client hesitated near the kiosk, Terence didn't just wave her over, he stood up, walked around the desk, and helped her complete her transaction step by step, all while speaking slowly and clearly. A few clients noticed. One even smiled and offered her place in line without prompting. Clarence, as always, was there before the lights came on, buffing the lobby tiles to a gleam. He whistled low while he worked, not a song, but a tone of contentment, the kind that only comes when something broken finally starts getting fixed. In the upstairs conference room, Brian had scheduled a series of optional sessions, not mandatory trainings, but open conversations. Real talk. "We're not calling these workshops," he'd said. "We're calling them reflections." Attendance? Near perfect. And during the first session, something unexpected happened. Eduardo spoke. He wasn't a loud man. He wasn't known for taking center stage. But that day, he stood with both hands on the back of a chair and told the staff about the moment he first thought Megan had gone too far. "Not just with Mr. Dandridge," he said. "But in the weeks before that. I heard the tone. I saw the eye rolls. I felt it in my gut. But I told myself, she's having a bad day. Maybe she didn't mean it." He paused. "But the truth is, people rarely mean it in the moment. That's why it still matters." There were nods around the room. Terence was one of them. The loan officer, too. Brian let the silence sit. No interruption. No agenda. Just letting people hear Eduardo's words settle in their own minds. Then he added, that moment of silence, when Elliot asked her if she would have treated him differently if he weren't someone important. "That's what this is all about. Every client who walks in here deserves dignity. Not when we know who they are. Always." By Wednesday, Elliot's visit had made its way to the annual regional leadership meeting. He wasn't there. He didn't need to be. But his name came up in a way few names ever did, spoken with respect, quoted from memory, referenced like a compass. And while Guardian State Bank wasn't about to change its entire structure overnight, one policy did quietly roll out before the week ended. Every branch would now have an anonymous reporting mechanism for behavior that didn't align with the bank's core values, not just from clients, but staff as well. The irony? Elliot hadn't asked for any of that. He'd said his piece. And left. But that was the power of what he did. Late Friday afternoon, Clarence was finishing up his rounds when a familiar voice called out from the entrance. "Clarence." The janitor turned. His eyes widened, but his expression didn't betray surprise, just deep respect. Elliot Dandridge had returned. He wore the same slate-gray windbreaker. Same quiet calm. But this time, the room didn't freeze. It breathed. Clarence stepped forward. "Didn't think we'd see you so soon." "I had some nearby meetings," Elliot said. "Thought I'd check in." Clarence nodded once. "You changed the air in here, sir. Not just the policies." Elliot gave a soft chuckle. "That's the goal." They exchanged a quiet handshake, man to man, not roles to titles. Terence spotted Elliot from across the room and made his way over, not hurried, but purposeful. "Mr. Dandridge," he said, "we've been talking about you all week. And, I spoke to Brian. We'd still love for you to speak to the interns sometime." Elliot studied him. Not dismissively. Thoughtfully. "You still think that matters?" he asked. "I do," Terence said. "Because it mattered to me." Elliot gave a short nod. "Then we'll make it happen." A few other employees gathered nearby. No ceremony. No announcements. Just presence. Judith wasn't there that day. But she had already followed up with corporate, requesting Elliot's insight be part of the onboarding curriculum for all new hires under her jurisdiction. Her note read simply. "You can't teach dignity. But you can remind people to recognize it." As Elliot prepared to leave again, the teenage boy from that first day came back with his mom. They were there to deposit a paycheck from the boy's first part-time job at the grocery store. "Mom, that's him," the boy whispered. His mother smiled. "You should tell him." So he did. "Mr. Dandridge," the boy said nervously. "You probably don't remember me." But I was here that day. When, all that stuff happened. Elliot smiled. I remember you. The boy stood straighter. I opened an account here because of you. Elliot nodded. Then I hope your account grows. In more ways than one. The boy laughed awkwardly, then grew serious. You didn't yell. But everybody listened anyway. That's how change begins, Elliot said. Not with noise. With presence. He turned toward the door again. Clarence held it open, not because Elliot needed it, but because it was right. Outside, the sky had turned orange-pink with sunset. Elliot moved forward, wheels rolling gently down the ramp. And inside, the bank continued as usual. But everything was different. Elliot Dandridge rolled down the sidewalk outside the West Haven branch for the second time that week, but this time, the air felt lighter. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because he'd seen something rare, the seed of genuine transformation taking root, in real people, in a real place. As he reached the parking lot, he didn't glance back. He didn't need to. He had already seen what mattered. Inside those glass doors, it wasn't about Megan anymore. It wasn't about punishment. It was about what everyone chose to carry forward after the moment had passed. Inside, Brian stood at the reception counter, watching Elliot disappear into the sunlight. He wasn't the same branch manager from a week ago, not in his posture, not in his silence. He turned to Eduardo and Terence, who stood nearby. We need to find a way to keep this going, he said. Not as a policy. As a practice. Terence nodded. It's already started. People feel it. Clients feel it. Eduardo added, even the ones who didn't see it unfold, something shifted. Brian looked around the lobby. Then let's make sure it lasts. And that became the mission of Guardian State's West Haven branch, not because corporate demanded it, but because a man who didn't demand anything had shown them who they really were. Weeks later, Elliot sat quietly in a small auditorium at the company's internal leadership seminar. Not on stage. Not holding a mic. Just watching. The speaker was a junior manager from a different branch, young, eager, nervous. And midway through her presentation on banking with integrity, she paused, adjusted her collar, and said, there was a story that went around a few weeks ago. About a man who visited a branch, unannounced. Some of you know him. Most of you probably don't. But I read every word of what happened. She looked out at the crowd. He never raised his voice. He never used his title. But in minutes, the room around him changed. Because he didn't walk in to demand respect. He gave it. And that changed everything. The room fell into a hush. Elliot didn't blink. He didn't need to. He just let the moment pass like a ripple through a still lake. Afterward, as attendees filed out, a regional director approached him. You really don't want any formal recognition for this? Elliot looked up. Recognition isn't the same as reflection. The second one lasts longer. The director blinked, then chuckled. We need more of you. You already have more of me, Elliot said with a smile. In Terence. In Eduardo. In Clarence. And he meant it. Back at West Haven, Clarence walked the lobby in the early evening. Floors gleamed. Desks were neat. But it was the people that made the place feel warm. Staff greeted each other with eye contact. Customers were offered help before being asked for it. There were fewer rushed transactions. Fewer brushed-off questions. And even fewer unspoken assumptions. One of the newer tellers, Jamie, fresh out of training, walked past Clarence on the way to clock out. Hey, Mr. Duval, she said. You've been here a long time, right? 30 years, Clarence replied without breaking stride. Jamie hesitated, then asked, have things always been like this, or did something change? Clarence stopped. Looked at her kindly. Then said, things always could be like this. They just needed someone to remind us. The story of Elliot Dandridge didn't go viral on social media. It didn't make national headlines. But it spread where it needed to, in the hearts of those who witnessed it. And in the quiet corridors of corporate offices, whispered during mentor sessions, retold in training rooms not for shock, but for clarity. What Elliot taught wasn't about outrage. It was about presence. It was about power that doesn't flaunt itself. Influence that doesn't demand attention. And leadership that listens first, then speaks. 1 week after the seminar, Terence received a package at the West Haven branch. No return label. Just his name. Inside was a simple hardcover notebook, embossed in silver with 5 words. You did the right thing. No signature. Just a note on the first page. Truth doesn't need a title. Just a witness. Ed. Terence clutched it, stunned. Across the lobby, Clarence watched him from the mop bucket, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. In a world where loud voices often drown out quiet strength, Elliot Dandridge reminded everyone that the most powerful kind of leadership is the kind that doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up. Observes. And when the time comes, it acts. Sometimes, the lesson isn't in the shouting. It's in the silence that follows. So the next time you meet someone you assume is just passing through, ask yourself. Would I treat them the same, if they owned the building I work in? Because they just might. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see something in yourself, share it. If it reminded you that kindness should never be tied to status, leave a comment. And if it gave you hope that quiet strength still exists, subscribe for more stories that echo deeper than words. True echo. Real voices. Real change.